So now I'm going to talk to you about the way we theorize that memory and learning happens. And this is the way we think of it. There's ongoing research in this area, but this will give you kind of a Cliff Notes version. So you have sensory input. So that might be you sitting down in the test center and looking at the test. And then you read the item that goes into your short-term memory. And then you should keep in mind that your short-term memory is limited. It can only handle 4 to 7 items. So something goes into short-term memory that you're trying to learn, then it goes down a rehearsal path, and you say it to yourself, you intend to remember, you get it going down that information processing model. And you rehearse it a couple of times, and finally it gets into long-term memory. Once it's in long-term memory, there's a feedback loop back and forth to short-term memory until you really have it. And then once it's really into long-term memory, you're theorized to have that forever. And now sometimes we don't tend to have it forever, but we think that it's always there. It's just making sure you can get it out of long-term memory. So long-term memory, you would retrieve it, and then it would go into output. So you'd remember that key idea that you memorized so long ago, and then you'd show what you know on the test. Well, you should know that along this path, at every point along this path, if you're stressed out and feeling test anxiety, then your level of ability to focus on learning or remembering at any point of this information processing model is impaired. So having some techniques to help you in the memory process and getting the information out on a test can really come down to just figuring out ways to relax yourself at the moment. Okay. So sometimes we forget things under pressure. One is because we never learned them. It never got into long-term memory. Another time sometimes we can have trouble showing what we know on a test because although it's in long-term memory, we can't get it out through the retrieval process because of stress. And also learning takes concentration. If you lose concentration in the number 2, in the short-term memory section, you can dump the information before it ever gets into long-term memory. And so chunking information can help you to get it into short-term memory. You can focus on it long enough to get it into long-term memory. And we're going to talk about some chunking techniques next. So there are a lot of ways that we forget things. I'm forgetting things all the time, as my children will tell me when I'm searching for my keys or I'm trying to remember how to get to that place I needed to get to. There are lots of ways that we forget things. And these are the 5 ways that, we have focused on. And for each of the ways that we forget, there's a strategy that you can use to reduce forgetting. So one of them has to do with decay. Some of you are studying things for step 1 that are really boring. And if you're studying something boring, it can be very hard to get it into short-term memory, to ever get it into long-term memory. And sometimes we can learn it, but it's just so dull that it fades over time. So it's important when you're trying to memorize things to think of ways to make it interesting to yourself so you can focus on it long enough to learn it. Some people will think about how an illness relates to someone they know, or they'll think about it in ways that are funny. They'll make up a funny story to help them memorize it. One of my students told me that he imagined the immune system as kind of like a little cartoon with bad guys and good guys and monsters. And that's how he imagined the immune system, and he remembered it really well for the step 1. For another thing that we can forget is called displacement. So that's when you cram at the end and you're trying to learn so many things at once that new information pushes out the old, and you just can't learn it all. And so think about it. If you are cramming, try to be strategic and not try to study it all. And if you possibly can, don't cram, especially for step one. This is a marathon of studying. It's not a quick sprint. You have to kind of learn it gradually. Give yourself lots of time to learn little bits and pieces and really learn them over time. Another way that we forget things has to do with interference. This is like if you're in high school and you're taking French and Spanish at the same time, you might mix up those words and it might be confusing to you which is which. So a principle to deal with that is to study things that are very different together instead of things that are similar. Okay, the last two principles, one of them has to do with incomplete encoding. So sometimes you thought you knew something, but you really didn't. And this is where self-testing comes in. And this is where the you girl questions are great. Maybe you think you understand the immune system, but do you really know it? That's where doing these very simple ways of self-testing to make sure that when you think you know something, you really know it. And we'll talk about some of the techniques you can use for that. And then the last one, and this is the one that is most associated with test anxiety, is retrieval failure. So you know all the information you've been studying all along. It's in long-term memory, but when it comes time to know it on a test, you freeze up and you go blank. And that can happen when you try to learn something in only one way. So we're going to talk about strategies to learn it with different parts of your brain so that if it freezes up with the verbal way that you remembered it, you can rely on the visual way, or you can rely on the story, or you can rely on something else, some other part of the brain where you've stored the information. So we're going to talk about those. But before we continue, do any of you have questions? Raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next section. So we talked about a couple of different forgetting strategies, and this is how you can deal with them. You can deal with the forgetting by self-testing often, active reading, active studying, visualization, recitation, and reviewing often. So we're going to talk about why that works for your brain. Okay, so this is one of the techniques of visualizing. So I don't know if anyone, raise your hand if you know the difference between a stalagmite and a stalactite. Do any of you know that funny thing that helps you to remember it? The way I remember it is this little saying I learned in my geology class, and it was stalagmites hold tight to the ceiling. And then, so those are the little kind of formations in a cave of dripping minerals that kind of drip down from the ceiling. And then when the water lands and creates a puddle, those create the stalagmites. So those are kind of a weird word to use. You might not know it. So remembering a funny little story that somehow relies on the sound can serve as a bridge between your memory and the funny story. You can also think of ways when you're studying something to visualize it, because that puts it in the visual part of your brain. You can also think in terms of big and little pictures. Learning the big picture first and then learning the details is useful for that principle, because you're trying to visualize how the different parts connect to one another. There are some other ways that you can use sound to memorize things. So with mnemonics, you can take the first letter of each thing that you have to remember and create a word or a sentence. So I remember the Great Lakes by remembering homes. So Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Homes is an easy way to kind of remember them because the first letter for Huron is H, the first letter for Ontario is O, and so on and so forth for the whole acronym. And for those of you who are trying to remember dementia, the frontotemporal, Lewy body, Alzheimer's, and vascular, FLAV takes the first letter of each, and that helps you to remember it. So that serves as a vehicle to chunk the information into 4 to 7 items, so it sticks in your short-term memory, and then you've got a link to your long-term memory. When you're coming up with these, a funny sentence is easier to remember than a boring sentence. So try to think of ways to make it interesting to you, like the student who came up with a little cartoon with the bad guys and the good guys. Make it interesting to you. This helps, humor helps to use a different part of your brain. So you want to store it in all these different parts of your brain. You want to use your visualization, your hearing, and your imagery. Okay. This is a technique. One of the things we talked about is thinking you know something, but really you don't. These are 3 different strategies you can use to self-test. Now, you have the UWorld questions and you have the other self-testing programs, but when you're working with your notes or a textbook, it's important to take some time and write things down. And when you write things down, you're storing it in the motor regions of your brain. So it's storing it in a whole different section. And when you're thinking of how to organize things, that's helping you to understand the big and little levels of information. So the questions in the margin system is for a textbook. You write your questions in the margins, and then you highlight the answers in the text. Then to self-test, you cover up the text, you read the question, and then you answer it, and then pull down the piece of paper to reveal the answer. You can do the same thing with the Cornell note-taking method. You take your notes, you write questions in the margin, you highlight the answers in your notes, you cover up the answers with a piece of paper, you read the question, you recite back the answer, and then you pull down the sheet of paper. This tells you immediately whether you know something. And some of you are very visual, and so you're going to benefit from making a mind map. And so you draw the main picture in the center, and then you make branches to all the details. And you can use that the same way. You can cover up the details and then recite back everything you know about that center idea. So these are ways for you to know when you really know something. And then when you don't know something, you can study it some more and figure out a different way to conceptualize it. Okay. And then another idea, we were talking about visualizing, hearing, and then there's reciting. When you recite something, there are a couple of reasons why this works. So what you're doing is you're saying, okay, what can I tell you about Lewy body dementia? Or what can I tell you about the frontal lobe? And then you just say out loud everything you know. And then you think about that. Saying it aloud, when you transfer it into your own words, you're doing some processing, and this transfers the information from one part of your brain to the other. It also works because you intend to remember. You're really focusing very hard, and it gets into your processing. It also works because you get immediate feedback. If you can't say it out loud, then you don't know it, and you need to study it some more. And this uses a different part of your brain. One of the students who talked to me about using this strategy, she would line up her stuffed animals and she would just talk to them, or she'd go get her dad, and her dad didn't know anything about medicine, and she would try to explain something to him in a way he would understand it. And doing this helped her to really learn it. So try this. If you're getting stuck, the trick with studying is just to be active about it, to keep doing various things so that you don't just stew, you don't just procrastinate. There are things you can do that are, you just keep doing them and eventually you learn the information. And then the last strategy that I think is important is to review often. So when you're making your study schedule, you can be tempted to say, oh, I'm just going to study all day, and that can be fine. But it's better to give yourself stop and end date time. So instead of saying, oh, I'm going to study for 8 hours, you say, okay, I'm going to study for 30 minutes, then I'm going to take a short break and go for a walk, and then I'm going to study for 30 minutes. It's better to break down your day. And then let's say your first chunk of time is immunology, then you pick something very different from immunology for your next section. This technique works because you focus on the beginning and the end of a learning period. So if you make the learning period 8 hours, you're going to know the first 15 minutes of what you've studied and the last 15 minutes. So you only get 30 minutes of active memorizing time. So it's better to break things up, and that way you can take advantage of really learning the things at the beginning and then the end of a study session. And it also helps you because it takes a while for an idea to kind of percolate in your brain to kind of be something you can actually use and study from.